The Cherokee knew what lived in these mountains before white people ever set foot in this country. We did not call them Bigfoot. We did not call them Sasquatch. We had a name for them that goes back so far nobody can say when the name started, and I am not going to give you that name because some things are not meant to be spoken into a recording that anyone can play. What I will tell you is that we knew them the way you know your neighbors. We knew enough to live alongside them without trouble, and enough to understand that trouble would come the day someone decided knowing wasn't enough, and that owning was better. My name is Herschel Stamper. I am 81 years old. I was born in the Big Cove community on the Qualla Boundary in western North Carolina in 1945, and I have lived within sight of these mountains my entire life. The Qualla Boundary is not a reservation in the way most people understand that word. It is land the Cherokee bought back with their own money after the Trail of Tears, after the federal government marched 11,000 of our people to Oklahoma and left the ones who hid in the Smokies to fend for themselves. We purchased our own homeland. We hold it in trust, and we have managed it according to principles that were old before any European ship crossed the Atlantic. Principles that include an understanding of who else lives on this land besides us. I am telling you this now because I am 81, and the world has changed in ways that make silence more dangerous than speech. For most of my life, silence was the right choice. The Cherokee kept quiet about certain things because keeping quiet protected what needed protecting. But the mountains are shrinking, the forests are thinner, the roads go deeper every year. And the families that live in the high places, the ones who have been there since before our oldest stories, are running out of room. So I am going to tell you what my grandfather told me, and what his grandfather told him, and what the Cherokee have understood for longer than America has existed. These beings trusted our people first. They trusted us because we earned it, across generations, by doing the one thing that most white families who came into these mountains could never bring themselves to do. We accepted them as they were. We never tried to catch them or study them or prove they existed. We simply lived alongside them and let them be, and in return, they let us see what they chose to show us. My grandfather was a man named Amos Stamper. He was born in 1895 in the same community where I was born, Big Cove, which sits in a valley along the Oconaluftee River at the base of ridges that climb up into the Great Smoky Mountains. Big Cove was, and still is, one of the most traditional communities on the boundary. When Amos was a boy, Cherokee was the only language spoken in most homes there. English was the language of the trading post and the government office, used out of necessity and put away when you got home like a borrowed coat hung on a peg. Amos spoke Cherokee his whole life and considered English a practical inconvenience, like mud on a good road. Amos was a timber man. He worked the logging crews that cut poplar and oak and chestnut in the drainages above the boundary, hard work in dangerous country, and he did it for 40 years, without a complaint that anyone in my family ever heard him make. He was not a large man, 5'8", maybe 160 pounds, with hands that had been thickened and scarred by decades of crosscut saws and cant hooks and the rough bark of trees wider than he was tall. He had a face like a piece of chestnut bark itself, dark and creased and patient, and eyes that watched everything and gave away nothing. Amos taught me about the forest as the Cherokee have always taught their children, which is to say, he took me into it and shut up and let me learn. He didn't lecture, he didn't explain. He walked, and I followed, and when I noticed something, he waited to see if I could figure out what it meant on my own. If I could, he'd nod. If I couldn't, he'd keep walking and give me another chance at the next thing. By the time I was 10, I could read a deer trail 3 days old, tell you which direction a thunderstorm was coming from by how the tulip poplars turned their leaves, and find my way home from any ridge within 5 miles of Big Cove without a compass or a trail. What Amos did not teach me about, not at first, were the other things in the forest. The things that were not deer or bear or turkey or any other animal that had a name in the books the government school made us read. He didn't mention them because you don't mention them to a child until the child is ready, and readiness is not about age, it is about quiet. A child who can walk through the woods without talking, without fidgeting, without stepping on every dry stick and scuffing every rock. A child who can sit still for an hour and watch a spider spin a web without getting bored. That child is ready. A child who can't do those things isn't, regardless of whether he's 10 or 30. I was 12 when Amos decided I was ready. It was the summer of 1957, late June, and we were walking a ridge trail above the Raven Fork, which is a creek that runs through the Big Cove community and feeds into the Oconaluftee. The trail wasn't on any map. It was a path the Cherokee had walked for centuries, maintained not by any government crew but by the steady passage of feet that knew where they were going. We had been walking since dawn, climbing through hemlock and Fraser fir and rhododendron so dense that the light on the forest floor had a green, submerged quality, like looking up from the bottom of a creek. Amos stopped at a place where the trail crossed a seep, a wet spot where groundwater oozed out of the mountain between two sandstone ledges. He knelt and touched something on the ground, then looked back at me and waited. I came forward and looked at what he was touching. It was a footprint. A single footprint, pressed deep into the soft mud beside the seep. It was shaped like a human foot, but it was not a human foot. It was at least 17 inches long, maybe 18, with 5 distinct toe impressions spread wide across the front, wider than any human foot I had ever seen. The depth of the impression told me that whatever had made it weighed far more than any person. I looked at Amos. He was watching my face as he always did in the woods. I want to tell you that I was calm, but I wasn't. My chest was tight and my hands were cold despite the June heat, and there was a buzzing in my ears that I later recognized as adrenaline. But I did not speak. I did not ask a question. I looked at the print, and I looked at the forest around us, and I looked back at Amos, and I waited, because that was what he had taught me to do. Amos said one word in Cherokee. He said a word that I am going to translate loosely as the old ones. That is not exactly what the word means, but it is close enough for a language that English was not built to carry. Then he stood up and kept walking, and I followed, and we did not discuss it again that day. But things had changed. A door had opened in my understanding of the forest, and through that door I could see things that had been there all along but that I hadn't known how to recognize. Over the rest of that summer and into the fall, Amos took me on walks that had a different purpose than the walks we'd taken before. He showed me things. A place where the bark had been stripped from a birch tree at a height of about 8 feet, the stripped area showing tooth marks that were too wide and too deep for a bear. A cluster of young sourwood saplings that had been bent over and woven together into a low dome, the weaving so precise that no wind could have produced it, and no animal I knew of had the hands to do it. A section of trail where the undergrowth on both sides had been pressed flat in a path about 3 feet wide, as if something very large had walked through recently. But the path went straight up a slope so steep that no deer or bear would have taken that route when easier ground was 20 yards to either side. Each time, Amos showed me the evidence and waited. He never said, "Look what they did." He never said, "This is a sign." He just stopped and looked and let me see it. And if I understood, I understood. And if I didn't, we moved on. By the end of that summer, I understood. The mountains above Big Cove were home to something that walked upright, that was large and heavy, that had hands capable of fine manipulation, that stripped bark and wove branches and traveled steep terrain with an ease that suggested it knew this country as intimately as I knew the path from my bed to the kitchen door in the dark. It had been there my entire life. It had been there my grandfather's entire life. It had been there, according to what the old people said without quite saying it directly, since before the Cherokee arrived in these mountains, and the Cherokee had been here for 1,000 years. What Amos taught me that summer was not information. It was a way of seeing. He was teaching me how to exist in a world that contained something bigger than me, something I would never fully understand. And the lesson was that the correct response to that was respect. The same respect you show a creek when it floods, or a rattlesnake when it suns itself on the trail. You don't hate the creek for flooding. You don't try to drain it or prove to your friends that it floods. You learn where the high ground is, and you stay on it. and you understand that the creek was there before your grandfather's grandfather, and it will be there after your grandchildren's grandchildren, and your job is to live alongside it without harming it or yourself. I need to tell you about a white family now, because the title of what you're listening to makes a promise, and I intend to keep it. The Cherokee trusted the old ones, and the old ones trusted the Cherokee, and that trust was built across generations of restraint and reciprocity. But white families came into these mountains too, starting in the 1700s and continuing ever since, and almost every single one of them failed at the one thing that would have earned them the same trust. They could not leave well enough alone. I say almost every one because there were exceptions, rare ones. I knew a white woman once who came close, genuinely close, to understanding, but even she couldn't hold it. And the reason she couldn't hold it was the same reason all the others couldn't. She had been raised in a world that told her everything unknown is either a threat or a prize, and even when her heart told her different, that training was a hook in her that she couldn't pull free. The family I want to tell you about was named Mercer, Boyd and Della Mercer. They came up from Macon County in 1968 and bought a piece of land on the edge of the boundary, not on Cherokee land itself, but close enough that their property backed up against the national forest on one side and the high ridges above Big Cove on the other. Boyd was a carpenter. He had been building houses in Franklin and Silva for 15 years, and he wanted a piece of ground of his own, somewhere quiet, somewhere the road ended and the trees started. Della was a teacher. She had taught 5th grade at Iotla Elementary in Franklin, and she planned to transfer to one of the schools in Swain County once they got settled. They were decent people. Boyd Mercer was not a bad man, and Della Mercer was not a foolish woman. They were ordinary white people from the North Carolina mountains, church-going, hard-working, polite to their neighbors, the kind of people who brought a casserole when someone in the community was sick. Boyd built their house himself, a solid 2-bedroom place with a stone chimney and a covered porch that faced the ridge line, and he did good work. The joints were tight, and the roof didn't leak, and the foundation was level, and I know this because I helped him pour it. That's how I met Boyd. He hired a few local men to help with the foundation work in the spring of 1968, and I was 23 and strong and willing to mix concrete for cash money. We worked together for 3 days, and Boyd was easy to work alongside. He didn't talk too much. He knew what he was doing. He had a level eye and a sure hand with a trowel, and he treated the Cherokee men on his crew the same way he treated the white ones, which in Swain County in 1968 was not something you could take for granted. Della was friendly in a way that felt genuine rather than performed. She brought coffee and sandwiches to the work site and asked about our families and remembered the answers the next day, which is a small thing but a telling one. She had a quick, bright way of looking at people that made you feel like she was actually seeing you, not just filing you under a category and moving on. I liked her. My wife, Letty, liked her too, and Letty did not warm to outsiders easily. The Mercers moved into the house in August of that year and settled in. Boyd took carpentry jobs around the county. Della started teaching at the elementary school in Cherokee, on the boundary itself, which meant she was one of the very few white teachers working with Cherokee children, and by all accounts, she did it well. She learned a few words of Cherokee, which the children found hilarious and endearing, and she ran a reading program after school that my niece attended and loved. The Mercers came to community events on the boundary when invited, which was not common for white families in the area. They were not exactly part of our world, but they were not hostile to it, and in that part of North Carolina, in the late 1960s, that was something. The trouble started in the fall of 1969, about 14 months after they moved in. What happened was simple and predictable, and if I had been paying closer attention, I might have seen it coming. Boyd was hunting. He had taken to hunting the ridges behind his property, working his way up into the national forest in pursuit of deer and turkey. He was a competent hunter. He knew how to walk quietly, how to read sign, how to sit still in a blind and wait. What he did not know, because nobody had told him, was that the ridges behind his property were not uninhabited. They were home. Boyd came down from the ridge one evening in late October and told Della he'd found something he couldn't explain. She told me about this conversation later, in the spring, and I remember the way she described his face when he walked through the door. She said he looked like a man who had opened a book he'd read 100 times and found a chapter in the middle that hadn't been there before. What he'd found was a structure, a lean-to, built against a rock ledge about 1.5 miles up the ridge from their house, constructed from hemlock branches and strips of bark and packed with dried leaves. Boyd was a carpenter. He knew construction. He said the structure was not random. The branches had been placed with intention. They interlocked at specific angles. The bark strips were layered to shed water. It was a shelter, built by something that understood how to build a shelter, and it was not built by a human being because there were no tool marks on any of the wood. The branches had been broken by hand, hands much larger than Boyd's, based on the thickness of the wood that had been snapped cleanly rather than cut. Boyd also found, at the base of the structure, a pile of acorn shells, hundreds of them, neatly stacked, like firewood, in rows that fit against each other with no wasted space. He said the precision of that pile bothered him more than the structure itself, because it suggested not just intelligence but a kind of orderliness, a domestic habit, that belonged to something that thought about its living space and kept it tidy. He told Della all of this, and Della, to her credit, did not dismiss it. She was a teacher and curious by nature. Boyd went back up the ridge the next morning with a Polaroid camera and photographed the structure and the acorn pile, and those photographs became the beginning of what Della would call their evidence file, a manila folder in her desk drawer that grew over the next year to include sketches, plaster casts, and 3 pages of handwritten notes, and that would contribute to the worst thing that happened on those ridges in my lifetime. But I am getting ahead of myself. I learned about the Mercer's discovery in November, not from them directly but from Letty's cousin Reva, who worked at the school with Della. Reva mentioned that the Mercer woman had been asking questions about the mountains, about whether the Cherokee had stories about large beings living in the high country, about Sulkalu, the figure in our old stories who is sometimes called the slant-eyed giant, the lord of the game, the one who lived on the high balds and taught the ancient hunters their laws. Della had been careful in her questions, Reva said. She wasn't pushy, she wasn't making fun, she was asking as a good student asks, with genuine interest and respect for the answer. But she was asking, and the fact that she was asking told me that she had seen something, or Boyd had seen something, and now they were trying to understand it. I went to see Amos. He was 74 years old in 1969, still living in the same house in Big Cove where he'd lived his entire life, a house he had built himself in 1922 from chestnut logs cut on the ridge above the Raven Fork. He was slower than he'd been, his knees bothering him, his lungs carrying the rasp of a man who'd breathed sawdust for 4 decades. But his mind was as clear as creek water, and his eyes missed nothing. I told him about Boyd's discovery and about Della's questions. He listened without interrupting, which was his way with anything that mattered. When I finished, he sat quiet for a long time. We were on his porch, the same porch where he'd told me 100 things I needed to know, looking out at the ridge that rose above the valley like a wall of green. The October light was low and gold, and the sourwood leaves had gone red, and somewhere up the drainage a pileated woodpecker was hammering a dead tulip poplar with a sound like a slow drumbeat. Amos said that the old ones had been watching the Mercer house since before it was finished. He said they always watched new people who came to the edge. He said they made decisions about new people the same way they made decisions about everything, slowly, over time, based on behavior rather than intention. A person's intention didn't matter to them. What mattered was what the person did, how they walked, how loudly they moved through the woods, whether they took more than they needed, whether they left the forest the way they found it, or whether they rearranged it to suit themselves. He said Boyd Mercer walked too loud and hunted too hard, not by human standards. Boyd was, as I said, a competent hunter by any measure a white man would use. But by the standards of the old ones, he took without offering, he entered their home without asking, He killed deer on trails they had been using for longer than the Mercer family had existed as a bloodline, and he did not acknowledge that the deer were shared. In the Cherokee way, and in the way of the old ones, you do not take from the forest without giving something back. This is as real and as binding as a handshake between neighbors over a shared fence line. You take a deer, you leave something: tobacco, cornmeal, a spoken acknowledgement that you are grateful and that you know the deer was not yours alone. Boyd did none of this. He couldn't have, because he didn't know, and he didn't know because nobody had told him, and nobody had told him because the knowledge belonged to a world he had never been invited into. Boyd Mercer was not a villain. He was a man doing what men in his world did, hunting the way he'd been taught to hunt, building the way he'd been taught to build, and none of his teachers had ever mentioned that the forest was someone else's home. That gap in what white America passed down to its children about the land they lived on is the real subject of what I'm telling you. The old ones did not distrust white families because white families were bad. They distrusted them because white families were deaf, not in their ears, in their understanding. Amos told me to watch the situation. He did not tell me to intervene. That was not his way. He believed that most problems between people in the forest sorted themselves out if you gave them enough time and enough room, the same way a creek finds its way around a fallen log without anyone having to move the log. But he also said that if the Mercer man started going up the ridge with something other than a rifle, with traps or cameras or other people, then I should come talk to him again. Because that would mean the situation had moved past curiosity into something else, and that something else was what the Cherokee had been protecting against for generations. The Cherokee have always understood that these beings choose when to be seen. That is not folklore. It is observation, accumulated across centuries. They are not clumsy. If you see one, you were meant to see it, and the seeing is part of a decision they made about you, not one you made about them. And if they decide you are safe, they show themselves in degrees. First, the evidence, the prints, the structures, the sounds at night. Then, if you respond correctly to the evidence, which means quietly and without aggression, they allow you a glimpse. A shape at the tree line, a silhouette against a ridge at dusk. Something you could explain away if you wanted to, and many people do want to, and the ones who want to explain it away are the ones who never see anything more. The ones who don't explain it away, the ones who accept what they've seen and continue to behave with restraint, those people enter a different category. The old ones watch them more closely. The evidence becomes less ambiguous. The glimpses become longer, clearer, harder to dismiss, and eventually, if the person stays quiet and respectful long enough, something like communication begins. Older than words, a mutual recognition that both parties are aware of each other and that neither intends harm. This process can take years. It took my grandfather decades. It took me 11 years from the day Amos showed me that first footprint to the day I saw one of them standing in clear view, looking at me across 50 yards of open forest, and the looking was not accidental. I was meant to see it. I had earned the seeing by 11 years of walking those ridges quietly, leaving offerings of tobacco and dried corn at the places Amos had shown me, taking only what I needed from the forest, and sitting still in clearings at dusk and letting the mountain do what it does when human noise stops, which is to fill with a different kind of presence, a density in the air, a watchfulness that you feel on the back of your neck, like the first warmth of morning sun. The day I saw my first one clearly was in the spring of 1968, a few months before the Mercers arrived. I was 23. I was walking a ridge trail above the Raven Fork, the same trail Amos had taken me on when I was 12, and I came around a bend where the rhododendron thinned out and the ridge opened onto a small grassy area, maybe 30 feet across, where a seep kept the ground soft and green, and it was there. It was standing at the far side of the clearing with its back to me, facing the valley. I stopped. Everything in me stopped. My feet, my breath, the noise in my head that humans carry everywhere without knowing it. All of it went quiet, and in the quiet I saw it clearly. It was tall, 7.5 feet, maybe closer to 8. Its shoulders were enormous, wider than any man I'd ever seen, and the hair covering its body was dark, almost black, with streaks of silver along the spine and shoulders that caught the late afternoon light. The hair was not short like a dog's coat. It was long, 3 or 4 inches, and it lay in a natural pattern the way human hair lies, following the contours of the muscle beneath. Its arms were long, longer in proportion than a human's, and its hands hung at its sides with fingers that were thick and blunt and very still. It turned its head, not its body, just its head, rotating on its neck to look at me over its shoulder, and I saw its face in profile. The brow was heavy, a shelf of bone that cast a shadow over the eyes. The nose was flat and wide. The jaw was massive but not jutting, set back under the cheekbones in a way that was more human than not. The eyes were dark, set deep, and they looked at me with an expression that I have spent 58 years trying to find the right word for. The closest I have come is recognition. It knew I was there, had probably known I was there for an hour before I came around that bend, and it had decided to let me see it, and now it was watching me to see what I would do with the seeing. I did what Amos had taught me. I stopped, I breathed, I lowered my eyes, not all the way to the ground, but enough to show that I was not challenging it, not staring, not demanding anything. I stood still and I let the moment be what it was, which was an introduction, the kind of introduction that happens between neighbors who have lived near each other for a long time but have never formally met. It held my gaze for maybe 15 seconds. Then it turned back to the valley, stood there for another moment, and walked into the tree line. 3 steps. That was all it took. 3 steps, and it was gone, absorbed into the hemlock and rhododendron as completely as if the forest had pulled a curtain closed behind it. I stood in that clearing for 20 minutes. My legs were shaking, not from fear, from something bigger than fear, something that had no name in English and barely had one in Cherokee. The sensation of having been present at something that rearranged the furniture in my understanding of what the world contained. I was 23 years old and I had grown up knowing these beings existed, had been taught by my grandfather to recognize their signs, had been walking their trails for a decade, and even with all of that preparation, the reality of seeing one with my own eyes was so large that my body didn't know what to do with it. So my legs shook, and I let them shake, and eventually they stopped, and I walked home, and I told Amos, and he nodded, and that was all. Through the winter of 1969 and into the spring of 1970, Boyd kept going up the ridge. He found more structures. He found tracks in mud and snow. He found a place where bark had been stripped from hemlocks in a pattern that ran along the contour of a slope for about 200 yards, every 3rd or 4th tree stripped at the same height, as if something had walked that route regularly and marked the trees as it passed. He photographed everything. He measured the tracks with a tape measure and recorded the dimensions in a notebook. He made plaster casts of the clearest prints, mixing the plaster in a coffee can he carried in his hunting pack. Della, meanwhile, was doing research. She wrote letters to university libraries requesting books about unknown primates and unexplained sightings in the Appalachians. She contacted a man in Ohio who published a newsletter about Bigfoot sightings in the eastern United States. She subscribed to 2 or 3 other newsletters of the same type, cheaply printed things that arrived in brown envelopes with names like the Eastern Tracker and Appalachian Mysteries. She was building a case, assembling evidence, preparing to do what every person trained in the Western tradition of knowledge does when they encounter something unknown. She was preparing to prove it. I watched this happen like watching a creek rise after a heavy rain, slowly at first, then faster. And by the time you realize the water is going to reach the road, it's already too late to move the car. I tried to talk to Boyd, once, in February of 1970, when I ran into him at the hardware store in Cherokee. I asked him how the hunting had been. He said fine. I asked him if he'd seen anything interesting up on the ridge. His face changed. A kind of eagerness came into it, and wariness at the same time, the look of a man who has a secret and wants to tell it, but isn't sure he can trust you with it. He said he'd found some unusual tracks. Big tracks. He asked me if I knew what kind of animal could leave a 17-inch footprint with 5 toes. I told him I didn't know. That was a lie, and I am not proud of it. But I did not know Boyd well enough to tell him the truth, and the truth was not mine alone to tell. It belonged to the Cherokee and to the old ones, and sharing it with a white man who was already accumulating photographs and plaster casts felt like handing a lit match to someone standing in dry leaves. Boyd pressed a little. He said the tracks were bipedal. He said whatever made them walked upright and had a stride of about 4.5 feet. He said he'd been reading about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, and he thought maybe there was something similar in the Smokies. He said it with a half-embarrassed, half-excited tone of a man who knows he's stepping outside the boundaries of what his friends would consider sensible, and I could see in his eyes that he wanted me to validate what he was thinking. He wanted me, a Cherokee who had lived in these mountains his whole life, to confirm that what he'd found was real. I told him the mountains had a lot of things in them that people didn't understand, and that the smartest thing a man could do with something he didn't understand was leave it alone. Boyd heard me, but he didn't listen. Hearing is receiving sound. Listening is changing what you do because of it. Boyd filed my words away and went right back up that ridge with his camera and his plaster and his notebook. This is not a moral failing. This is a cultural training. Boyd Mercer was doing exactly what his upbringing had equipped him to do, gathering evidence and applying method. And the tragedy is that every step he took in that direction was a step away from the only outcome that could have served everyone. Because they were watching, and what they saw when they looked at Boyd Mercer was a man who had been given a glimpse into a world that most humans would never see, and instead of receiving it with gratitude and restraint, he was using it to build a case. He was turning their home into a research site. The old ones had seen this before. White men had been coming into these mountains with measurement tools and the certainty that everything unknown was meant to be known for over 200 years. The elk were hunted out before 1800. The chestnut trees, which covered these ridges in a canopy so thick you could walk a mile without seeing sky, died to the blight in the early 1900s. The rivers were dammed and stocked with fish that didn't belong here, while the native brook trout retreated into the headwater streams. The pattern never changed. White men arrived, they saw something, they wanted it, they took it, and what they took was diminished by the taking. The old ones had survived all of this by doing one thing. They had stayed invisible to the people who would have destroyed them if they'd been visible. They had retreated up the ridges, deeper into the old growth, further from the roads and the houses and the cameras and the traps, and they had maintained a boundary that most humans never crossed, because most humans never knew it existed. Boyd Mercer was crossing that boundary, not physically, not yet, but in his intent. And intent, to the old ones, was as legible as a footprint in mud. The spring of 1970 was when things began to go wrong. Boyd contacted the man from Ohio, the newsletter publisher, and invited him down to North Carolina to see the evidence. The man's name was Dwight Loomis, and he ran a one-man operation out of Columbus that tracked reported sightings east of the Mississippi and published quarterly summaries with hand-drawn maps and subscriber testimonials. Dwight drove down in April and spent 3 days with the Mercers, hiking the ridges with Boyd, examining the photographs and casts, taking his own measurements. I did not meet Dwight, but Della described him to me later. She said he was a thin, excitable man with glasses and a canvas vest full of pockets, and that he talked faster than anyone she'd ever met. He was thrilled by Boyd's evidence. He told Boyd it was some of the best documentation he'd seen east of the Pacific states, and he wanted to include it in his next newsletter and possibly organize a larger expedition to the area in the summer with other researchers and better equipment. Della told me this in May at the school after a parent-teacher meeting for my niece. She pulled me aside in the hallway and told me about Dwight's visit and about the planned expedition, and I could see in her face two things at war with each other. She was excited because Boyd's excitement was infectious, and because the teacher in her loved the idea of discovering something unknown. She was also uneasy because something in her gut, something deeper than her education and her curiosity, was telling her that what they were doing was wrong. She didn't use that word. She said it feels like we're pushing into something that doesn't want to be pushed into, and she asked me, directly and seriously, whether the Cherokee had any knowledge of large beings in these mountains. I had to decide, in that moment, how much to tell her. Amos was 75 years old and his health was failing. He had emphysema from the sawmill years, and his legs swelled if he stood too long. And I knew, with the particular certainty that comes from watching someone you love get smaller against the landscape, that he would not be walking these ridges much longer. The responsibility was shifting to me, and with it came the burden of every decision about who to trust and how much to share. I told Della a version of the truth. I told her that the Cherokee had stories going back centuries about beings that lived in the high mountains. I told her about Sulkalu in general terms, the great figure of our old stories, the one who was lord of the game and keeper of the high places. I told her that the Cherokee considered these mountains to be home to more than what biology textbooks listed. And then I told her, as directly as I could without explaining the full depth of what I knew, that bringing outsiders into those ridges with cameras and measurement tools would be a mistake that could not be undone. Della listened. She was a good listener, better than Boyd, and I could see the words landing in her like stones landing in water, sinking down past the surface into a place where they would settle and stay. She thanked me. She said she would talk to Boyd, and for a few weeks, I believed she had. The expedition never happened, not the way Dwight Loomis had planned it. Boyd called it off in early June, and Della told Riva that the decision had come after a long argument between her and Boyd about whether they had the right to bring other people into the situation. I don't know exactly what Della said to Boyd during that argument, but whatever it was, it worked. Boyd told Dwight the timing wasn't right, and Dwight went back to Ohio, disappointed but patient, and the summer of 1970 passed without strangers on the ridge. But Boyd didn't stop. He reduced his trips, but he didn't stop, and in the fall of that year, he did something that changed the nature of what was happening between him and the old ones. He brought a dog. Boyd had a blue-tick coonhound named Jasper, a big-boned dog with a deep voice and a nose that could pick up a cold trail in a rainstorm. Boyd had used Jasper for bear hunting in Macon County, and the dog was fearless in the woods, the kind of hound that would tree a bear twice his weight and stand baying at the base until the hunter caught up. Boyd brought Jasper up the ridge in late September, not to track anything specifically, but because he wanted the dog's nose as a kind of early warning system, a way to know when something large was in the area before he could see or hear it himself. What happened with Jasper was the first clear sign that the old ones had moved past tolerance and into warning. The dog went up the ridge eager and confident, the way a good hound approaches any stretch of unfamiliar forest. Nose down, tail up, ears swinging. About a mile from the house, at the place where the trail entered the denser hemlock forest and the light dropped to a green, half-dark, even at midday, Jasper stopped. Boyd told me about this later, and I remember the bewilderment in his voice. He said the dog planted his feet and refused to move. His hackles were up from his neck to his tail, a ridge of stiff hair that Boyd had never seen on Jasper before, not even when the dog was facing a bear. Jasper was trembling, and it was not excitement. It was the shaking of a dog that has run into something so far outside its experience that its body has no other response. Boyd tried to coax the dog forward. Jasper would not move. Boyd tried pulling the lead. Jasper braced his legs and leaned backward. Then Jasper did something that Boyd said disturbed him more than anything else in the 2 years of his investigation. The dog lay down, flat on his belly, chin on the ground, eyes forward, every muscle rigid. And he whined, a high, thin sound that Boyd had never heard from Jasper, closer to submission than fear. The sound a dog makes when it recognizes that whatever is ahead of it is so far above it that the only correct response is to make itself small. Boyd stood on that trail with his dog flat on the ground, and he looked into the hemlock forest and saw nothing. Just trees and the green half-dark, and a silence I had learned to recognize as a boy, the kind that means the forest is holding its breath. He turned around and went home. Jasper followed eagerly, tail between his legs, and for the rest of the day the dog would not leave the porch. Boyd did not bring Jasper up the ridge again. I learned about the Jasper incident from Della, and this time there was no excitement in her account. There was worry. She told me the dog had not been the same since that day, that Jasper whimpered and pressed himself against the wall of the house at night, and that sometimes, in the early hours before dawn, when the forest above their property was at its quietest, the dog would start a low, unbroken howl that raised the hair on Della's arms, even inside the house with the doors locked. She said she could feel something up there, a pressure, like the air before a storm, except it didn't break, it just held. I went to Amos. I told him about the dog. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them, he looked tired in a way that I understood was not physical. It was the tiredness of a man watching something unfold that he has seen before and knows the ending of. He told me that the old ones were sending the Mercer family a message. The dog was part of the message. When they want a person to stay away, he said, the first thing they do is speak to the animals, because animals understand things that humans refuse to hear. A dog that will not go forward is telling its owner what the forest is telling the dog, which is that the boundary has been reached and there is nothing beyond it for you. If the owner listens to the dog, the situation resolves. If the owner ignores the dog, the next message comes to the owner directly. I asked Amos what the next message looked like. He said it depended on the person. Sometimes it was sound. A vocalization in the night, close to the house, so loud it rattled the windows, and so deep it sat in your chest like a fist. Sometimes it was smell, that heavy musk they carried, left as a territorial marker on trees and rocks near the property line, a smell so powerful that it stopped you in your tracks and held you there while your brain tried to place it and failed. Sometimes it was visual, a silhouette on the ridge at dusk, motionless, enormous, watching, presented not as a secret glimpse meant to build a relationship, but as a display, a warning, the way a bear stands on its hind legs, not to see better, but to show you how big it is. I asked Amos what happened if the person didn't listen to any of those messages. He looked at me for a long time without speaking, and what I saw in his eyes was a weariness that came from having watched this pattern repeat across a lifetime. He said they leave. The old ones leave. They abandon the territory they have lived in for generations and move deeper into the mountains, higher up, into country so steep and dense that following them on foot is not possible. And the place they leave behind becomes empty in a way that you can feel if you know how to feel it. The birdsong returns, but it sounds wrong. The forest grows back, but it grows without guidance. The balance that the old ones maintained, the way they managed the deer population and the plant growth and the movement of predators through the drainage, all of that falls apart, and the forest becomes ordinary. Trees and dirt, and nothing watching over any of it. Amos said this had happened twice in his lifetime. Once in the late 1940s, when the government finished pushing the Blue Ridge Parkway through the mountains near the boundary. The road had been planned since the 30s, and the Cherokee had fought it for years, but eventually the blasting started, and the cuts went through ridges that had been unbroken since before anyone had a word for time. The old ones left that drainage entirely, moved east into the Plot Balsam Range, and then higher up toward the Smokies crest. And once in the 1950s, when logging crews from a company based in Waynesville cleared a swath of old growth above the Tuckasegee River that had been home to a family group for as long as anyone could remember, Amos said the logging crew never saw anything. They didn't need to. The old ones saw the survey flags and heard the chainsaws and were gone before the first tree fell. Amos walked that ground the following spring and said it felt dead. Not barren, dead. The way a house feels dead after a family moves out. The structure is there, but the life is gone. I asked Amos what I should do about the Mercers. He said I should do what the Cherokee have always done when a white family stumbles into something they don't understand. Give them one more chance to listen. One clear, direct final chance, and if they don't take it, let them go. Because you cannot force a person to accept what they are not built to accept, and trying to force it does more damage than letting them fail on their own. So I went to Boyd and Della's house. It was October of 1970. a Saturday afternoon, and the sourwood was red on the ridge above their property, and the air had that late fall bite that tells you the mountains are about to go to sleep for the winter. Della made coffee. Boyd came in from the workshop where he'd been sharpening tools. We sat on their porch, the three of us, looking at the ridgeline, and I told them the truth. I didn't tell them everything. I kept back my own sighting, the Cherokee name for the old ones, and the specific places on the ridge where I knew they traveled and rested. But I told them that what Boyd had been finding up there was real, that it was a being, an intelligent being, that had lived in these mountains for a very long time, and that the Cherokee had maintained peace with it by following a single principle that I was asking Boyd and Della to follow now. Leave it alone. Put the cameras away and the plaster back in the garage and stop writing to people in Ohio. Accept that it exists and let it exist, and in return, it will let you exist. Over time, if you are patient and quiet, it may even show itself to you on its own terms. Boyd listened. Della listened. And I could see, on Della's face, something opening, a willingness, a softening. She looked at the ridge with new eyes, not the eyes of a researcher building a case, but the eyes of a person recognizing that she had been living next to something sacred and had been treating it like a specimen. Boyd's face was different. Boyd's face was closed. He was polite. He thanked me for coming. He said he appreciated the information. He said he'd think about it. And I knew, watching his jaw set and his eyes go flat, that thinking about it was exactly what he was going to do, and that thinking was the problem, because Boyd Mercer was a man who solved problems by thinking them through and then acting on the conclusion. And the conclusion he was going to reach was that if these beings were real and intelligent and living in his backyard, then someone needed to know, someone official, someone with resources, because a discovery this significant couldn't just sit in a manila folder, in a desk drawer, in a house at the end of a dirt road in Swain County. I left their house that afternoon with a heaviness that I carried through the winter. I had done what Amos told me to do. I had given them one clear chance, and I could feel, in my bones, that Boyd was not going to take it. The spring of 1971 is when it happened. Boyd contacted a professor at Western Carolina University in Cullowhee, a biology teacher named Dr. Harold Keene, and showed him the photographs and the plaster casts and the notebook full of measurements. Keene was skeptical, but intrigued. He agreed to come to the Mercer property and examine the evidence in the field. Boyd set a date for the last weekend of March. I found out about the planned visit from Riva, who heard Della mention it to another teacher at the school. I went up the ridge that evening, alone, to a place I had been visiting for 3 years, a clearing near the seep where Amos had shown me my first footprint, a place where I sometimes left offerings of tobacco and cornmeal and sat in the failing light and waited. I had never spoken aloud there before. I had communicated the way the Cherokee have always communicated with the old ones, through presence and gesture and the quiet accumulation of visits that proved I was not a threat. But that evening I did something I had never done. I spoke. I spoke in Cherokee. I sat on the ground and I said, in the language my grandfather had taught me, that a man was coming to the ridge with tools and questions and the intention of proving what lived there. I said that I had tried to stop it and failed. I said that I was sorry, and I asked them to forgive the intrusion and to understand that not all people who came into the forest came with the same heart, and that the Cherokee were still here and still keeping faith and still honoring the old agreements, even if the world around us had forgotten they existed. I sat there for an hour after I finished speaking. The forest was quiet, not the heavy, watching quiet that I had learned to recognize as their presence, just quiet, empty, like a room where someone has been sitting and has just gotten up and walked out. I went home and told Letty I thought the old ones were already gone. The professor came that last weekend of March. Boyd took him up the ridge. They hiked for 6 hours, visiting every site Boyd had documented over 2 years. They found nothing. Every structure, every stripped hemlock, every acorn pile, gone. The sites Boyd had photographed so carefully were clean, the way a well-swept floor is clean. Every trace had been removed with a thoroughness that went beyond weather or decay. It was intentional. They had erased themselves. Boyd was bewildered. The professor was politely unimpressed. He told Boyd that the photographs were interesting, but without corroborating field evidence, he couldn't justify any further investigation. He drove back to Cullowhee, and that was the end of it, academically. But it was not the end of it for Boyd, and it was not the end of it for me. Boyd became obsessed. He went up the ridge every day for the next 2 weeks, expanding his search area, going higher and deeper into the national forest than he'd ever gone before, looking for any sign that what he'd spent 2 years documenting hadn't simply vanished. He found nothing. The ridge was silent and empty and ordinary. Just trees and rocks and creek water and the usual birds and the usual squirrels and nothing else. Della came to see me in April. She came alone to our house in Big Cove, and she sat at my kitchen table with Letty and drank tea and told us that Boyd had not slept properly in 3 weeks. She said he barely ate. She said he went up the ridge before dawn and came back after dark and sat on the porch staring at the tree line until Della turned off the lights and begged him to come to bed. She said he had started talking about going public, about contacting a newspaper in Asheville, about writing a letter to the Smithsonian. She said she was frightened, not of the ridge, of her husband, of what the absence of the thing he'd been chasing was doing to him. I told Della the truth that I had not told her on the porch in October. I told her they were gone. I told her they had left because Boyd had brought a stranger with measurement tools into their home. I told her that this is what happens when you push past the boundary, when you refuse to accept a gift on the terms it was offered and instead try to convert it into proof. The gift is taken back. The givers leave. And the place they leave behind is emptier than you can imagine, because it isn't just the absence of a being. It is the absence of a relationship that took 100 generations to build and that one man dismantled in a single season with a camera and a can of plaster. Della cried, quietly, the way a person cries when they know they helped break something that cannot be fixed. She asked me if they would ever come back. I told her I didn't know. I told her that in the 2 times Amos had seen it happen, the old ones had not returned to the specific place they'd abandoned. They had moved on, found new ground, started again. But the old ground stayed empty. The Mercers sold their house in the fall of 1971 and moved back to Macon County. Boyd went back to building houses in Franklin. Della went back to teaching at Ayatla Elementary. I never saw either of them again, though Riva told me years later that Della had divorced Boyd in 1974 and remarried a man from Waynesville who sold insurance, and that Boyd had moved to Virginia and nobody knew what became of him after that. The ridge did not recover for years. I walked it every month, leaving tobacco, sitting in clearings, being present in the way Amos had taught me. For the first 3 years, there was nothing. The forest was just forest, trees and dirt and the sound of water and the absence of something I couldn't name but could feel, a hollowness in the air, a gap in the life of the mountain that had nothing to do with ecology and everything to do with what had been there and wasn't anymore. In the winter of 1974, almost 3 years after the old ones left, I found a track, a single track, in snow, on a ridge about 2 miles above where the Mercer house had been. It was smaller than the ones Boyd had measured, younger, maybe, or a different individual. But it was there, and it was fresh, and when I knelt beside it and touched the edge with my finger, I felt something return to my chest that had been missing for 3 years. Closer to the feeling you get when you hear a familiar voice after a long silence and realize you'd been holding your breath without knowing it. They came back slowly, over years, fewer of them and in different places. The old patterns were broken and new ones formed, the way a creek finds a new channel after a flood. More cautious than before, harder to read, leaving fewer signs. The repair took a generation. Amos died in the winter of 1978. He was 83. He died in his house in Big Cove, in his bed, with my grandmother beside him and the sound of the Raven Fork in the valley below. I was 33. I had been walking the ridges on my own for 7 years by then, and I would walk them for another 47 years after his death, carrying what he taught me the way a man carries a fire through a rainstorm, carefully, quietly, protecting it from the wind. I am 81 now. My knees are bad, and the ridges that I used to climb in an hour take me 3 hours, and sometimes I don't make it to the top and just sit on a rock halfway up and watch the light change on the valley and let that be enough. My son, Curtis, walks the ridges now. He is 54, and he learned in silence, over years, one piece of knowledge at a time, given when he was ready and withheld when he was not. He has seen them. He has sat in clearings at dusk and left his offerings and maintained the old agreements, and they know he is safe. But the world is different now. The roads go further. The houses climb higher up the ridges. The national forest is crisscrossed with hiking trails that bring tens of thousands of people a year into country that 30 years ago was visited by nobody. And there are cameras now on phones that every person carries, and the instinct to document has become so deeply wired into the way people move through the world that the idea of seeing something and not photographing it is almost unthinkable. Boyd Mercer, with his Polaroid and his plaster casts, was the leading edge of a wave, and that wave has become a flood. And the old ones are being pushed further and higher and into smaller and smaller pieces of country that no one has found yet. The Cherokee are still here. We still keep the old agreements, still walk the ridges, still leave the offerings. The Qualla Boundary is still managed, in part, according to principles that account for who else lives on this land, even though those principles are not written in any official document. We protect what lives in these mountains by keeping quiet, by knowing when to speak and when to hold still, and by understanding that some things are not meant to be proven. What I want you to take from this story is not that white families are incapable of understanding. That is not what I believe. Della Mercer understood. She understood on that porch when I told her the truth, and she understood in my kitchen when she wept for what had been lost. The capacity for acceptance lives in every person, but it has to be cultivated. It has to be taught. It has to be passed down, the way the Cherokee passed it down across 100 generations, each generation adding to the understanding and refining the practice and correcting the mistakes of the generation before. You cannot learn it from a newsletter. You cannot build it from photographs and measurements. You cannot buy it with evidence. It is earned through years of being present in a place without taking from it, and the earning never stops. The old ones are still out there. I know this the way I know my own name. I have sat in those clearings at dusk and felt them watching me, felt their attention pressing on my skin, and I have understood that the watching is itself a gift. It means they have not given up on us. It means the agreements still hold, even in a world that would not believe them if I published them in a newspaper and stapled the evidence to every telephone pole in Swain County. They hold because the Cherokee have honored them for 1,000 years, and because my son will honor them when I am gone, and because his children will honor them when he is gone, and the chain will not break. I will not let it break. It is the most important thing I have ever done, more important than any job I held, any house I built, any vote I cast. The most important thing I have ever done is walk into those mountains and sit down and be quiet, and let something ancient and gentle and unimaginably patient know that it is not alone, that someone remembers, that someone still cares enough to show up and shut up and listen. If you are a person who goes into the woods, in these mountains or any mountains, I have one thing to ask of you. Leave your camera in your pocket and your theories at home. Go in with empty hands and a quiet mind, and give the forest the one thing it asks of you, which is respect. Understanding, if it comes at all, takes a lifetime. The Cherokee learned this 1,000 years ago. It is not too late for you to start.